Hello, and welcome to 16-Bit Gems. I'm Tom from the Weird Video Games Show, filling in for Roo, who's disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Have you ever blah 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 segue? Well, internet meme, Phantom 2040.
Phantom 2040 is a Super Nintendo game based on the cartoon series of the same name, which is a futuristic spin-off of the Phantom comic books, which you might know if you've seen or at least heard of the Billy Zane movie where he dresses up in purple and punches the camera.
If you don't know anything about the Phantom 2040 series, or even anything about the Phantom at all, don't worry. Your ignorance only nourishes me.
Even though this game has a large number of characters and a complex plotline, it's very easy to follow, even from a total newcomer's point of view. I myself knew absolutely nothing about the franchise the first time I played, and was able to jump right in and perfectly understand. The year is, surprisingly, 2040, and takes place in a sprawling metropolis called Metropia. It's not as stupid as it sounds. Trust me, I'm from the internet. The Phantom is a superhero who is charged with protecting the ghost jungle, and comes from a long line of superheroes. Every time a Phantom is killed, his son takes his place as the new Phantom, thus creating the legend that the Phantom is just one man who is immortal. This particular Phantom is the 24th, and named Kit Walker. And really, that's all you need to know to get started. The story, as far as games go, is actually really well done, even if the dialogue is just a bit stilted. Okay, it's pretty embarrassing at times. But you have a fast-paced plot, an intriguing mystery to solve, a gigantic cast of interesting characters, and the protagonist of the story doesn't just have a simple rescue the princess sort of conflict, but gets tangled up in something huge, and everywhere he turns, things just keep taking turns for the worse. Right from the beginning, it's personal, as Kit's friend, a local professor, gets trapped inside when the university explodes. As Phantom runs after the robots that caused the attack, he ends up being spotted by eyewitnesses and implicated for the crime. If that's not bad enough, suddenly a gigantic blast in downtown Metropia kills thousands of people. Rioting and looting starts, and roving gangs start tearing the streets up. Phantom, being the only superhero in town, has to intervene, even while on the run from police and investigating the attack on his friend, and this is all still the first chapter. Well, I'm hooked. There is an environmental message to this game, but as far as environmental messages go, it's very much subdued. I mean, sure, there are robots absolutely everywhere that are mass-produced right there in the city, but the trappings of a tired robot apocalypse story just aren't here. The biots, as they're called, are simply servants of whoever controls them, making them both a fun, dispensable enemy for your hero, as well as a reflection of the control the wealthy megalomaniac villains of the game have on the city, without being turned into an over-the-top villain themselves. Just from looking at the city map, you can see that the ghost jungle has become part of this gigantic megacity, and that alone really says a lot. Despite technological development and aggressive expansionism, the preservation of wildlife is still important, even inside a megacity. There's a subplot involving one last living Black Panther, suggesting that in the year 2040 they'll have reached the brink of extinction. There's also a wildlife memorial in town showing a myriad of animals that have already become extinct. But I guess life goes on. Or at least it does for us video game playing Westerners. It's just great seeing the message of protecting the environment being incorporated into a game without smothering the player with gigantic plot cushions.
Okay, so enough about the story. What about the gameplay? Well, to put it in objective terms, it's awesome.
It's like Spider-Man meets Mega Man. Phantom is able to equip two weapons to the buttons X and Y, representing the weapons in his left and right hand. As you play and defeat bosses, or otherwise discover hidden caches, you can collect weapons with all sorts of useful effects. Like Mega Man. You start with just a simple energy blast, but along the way you can collect homing missiles, a spread attack, boomerangs, and fire retardant pellets. Sure, why not? There are many features to this that are extremely clever and well thought out. When you fire spread attacks, you have the option to hold down the attack button to fire one large pellet, and release when you want it to spread, giving you better control on how far you want the smaller projectiles to land. There's one weapon you get early on called a breaker, which is fairly useful, but more than anything, it's just fun. It's a large explosive dart that sticks to its target, and then after a few seconds delay, it explodes. It's one of the most powerful projectiles in the game, but its slow firing rate, delay, and the fact that you can only have so many on screen at once makes its usefulness questionable in the later chapters. Still, you'll have no end of fun firing a dart right into the face of a biot who freezes in place like he's stopping to figure out exactly what went wrong, then blows up. If you're really good, you can pull off some really stylish action movie style scenes where you take out every enemy on screen and then strike a pose and wait for them to all blow up in sequence. You also have things like explosive crates, which have so many functions. They can be a hazard, or they can be a powerful weapon, or they can be some imaginary third thing. The possibilities are endless. The fact that you can equip two weapons at once is just great. You can set both to the same weapon and furiously mash the two attack buttons to deal as much damage as possible, or you can set them to two separate weapons so you can use the right tool for the right job without having to constantly go to your menu and switch out. What's more, certain combinations of weapons will have an extra effect. If you equip spread and homing missiles, you can fire the missiles in a spread pattern and they'll each home in on your targets. Or you can spread out a bunch of breakers. Or you can make a breaker home in on your target, which almost seems unfair.
Dog, that's a homing breaker. One of the most hardest hitting homing missiles in a game, and I can't even fly that fast. But I put the team on my back though.
There are many different ways you can use your equipment here. Just be aware that all of your weapons will use up weapon energy. If you run out of energy, not to worry, Phantom is still very capable of dealing damage with his fists. In fact, if you like, you can set one of his attack buttons to close combat even while you have plenty of energy left if you want to conserve ammo, or just to have fun with his various martial arts attacks. He can punch, do jumping and sliding kicks, and even pick up and throw enemies at each other, just like a beat 'em up. This game has everything. Oh, and when I said he's like Spider-Man, it's not just because he's a superhero, or a fast and agile superhero at that. He has a special tool called an inductance rope that can temporarily freeze enemies, and allows him to climb walls and swing around. It starts out with only a little bit of reach, but as you play through you find rope extension pickups that allow him to reach and swing across further distances. The physics to this rope are pretty decent for a 16-bit game. You can swing back and forth, blasting or kicking enemies as you go, and expand or retract the rope to give yourself a longer swing, or to pull yourself up, or keep yourself a little steadier. With just a bit of practice, you can easily scale tall buildings and pursue fleeing enemies across airborne traffic during rush hour. The controls are excellent, which is fortunate because the game can be very challenging, and with the amount of platforming and the constant barrage of projectiles that are involved, you'll need tight controls. And lots of health containers shaped like human skulls. The game is also extremely non-linear. Anytime you retreat to your lair in the Ghost Jungle, which is usually your default starting point at the beginning of every chapter, you can pick a spot in the city to go next. The game will point you in the right direction, but you can always head off your own way and explore, and the game will often reward you for doing so with plenty of secret areas and extra power-ups. At the beginning of the game, many of the places will be locked out, so you can slowly learn the layout of the game's world without getting overwhelmed with too many options, or worry about wandering into an area too tough for you. Each of these locations eventually becomes accessible as you become more powerful and progress further in the story. And if you're ever confused about anything, you can always go back to the Ghost Jungle and consult the Bat Computer, or, I don't know, the Ghost Computer. You're pretty much Batman here, so we can just pretend it's the Bat Computer. You can use it to read up on character profiles and locations to give you a little more insight into the world you inhabit, or you can just talk to, Alfred, and he'll have something to say. The music is not only very catchy, but also provides cues so you know you're still on the right track. If you are, some exciting, fast-paced music plays depending on what chapter of the story you're on. If you're exploring, or wandering around an area that's not going to move you forward through the plot, some slightly more ambient music will play that varies depending on your location. When you're hanging out in the streets, there's a lot of background noise, including traffic, distant gunfire, and sirens. In the Biot Factory, you'll hear a cold, robotic, industrial sort of track. The Ghost Jungle is full of eerie animal noises. The only complaint I have about this is the fact that each chapter only has one real music track to it, which seems to apply better in one location than another. This one track works really well for the streets, where the Mad Max-style gangs are everywhere, but when you continue on to the Battleship Factory, it no longer seems as fitting. One of the really great features about Phantom 2040 is its branching storyline. The key elements stay more or less the same, but right from the very beginning you make choices that affect the plot and the playthrough. Do you run in and try to save Professor Archer, or do you pursue the biots and find out who sent them? Whatever choice you make will change how the story progresses. There are countless alternate endings, some good, mostly bad. But don't worry, the decisions that determine whether you get a favorable ending really come at the end of the game. While your early decisions do drive the plot, none of them irreparably harm the final outcome. So we've got an action, mystery, superhero platform shooter beat 'em up that's open-ended with multiple endings. Is there anything this game doesn't have? Well, unfortunately, yes. It doesn't have a save feature. And that means you'll have to rely on passwords. Yeah, I know, it's kinda sucky. But the good news is, if you make it all the way to the end and get a bad ending and want to go back a little bit and try to fix it, having some passwords written down will give you a little bit more flexibility, and as such, is a lot less frustrating than having saved your game right after it's already too late, and your only option is to erase and start over from the beginning. So remember, keep your passwords.
Passwords aside, this is an incredibly fun game, and it always kind of perplexed me that nobody ever really paid attention to it. A decent number of copies were made, but very few people have actually played it. I wish I knew why. The good news about that is you can get on eBay for really cheap. I got myself a copy for $2 plus shipping. My finger is there so you can't see where the label is torn. You might be able to get it for even cheaper. Or you can get the Sega Genesis version, which isn't really the same.
The graphics are pretty inferior. The music, being on a Genesis, is not nearly as good. There's also a much smaller selection of tracks, which means the utilitarian purpose of music in this game is totally diminished. Wait, let me put that in normal speak. The music doesn't tell you where to go anymore. The sounds actually are surprisingly pretty good in the Genesis version. I still prefer the Nintendo sounds, but they're much better and more realistic than you'd come to expect from a Genesis game. And unlike the SNES version, the explosion sounds have a bassy loudness to them that makes you almost feel them. Pretty impressive considering the hardware. The gameplay is also kind of diminished. The controls are much more awkward. The inductance rope is assigned to the Z button, which is way up here away from the main buttons, whereas the A button on the SNES is very accessible. Being able to effortlessly jump and sling is very important if you want to navigate the game. Personally, I would have preferred if inductance rope was assigned to the C button, B jumped, and the two weapon slots were X and A. But of course, there's the whole compatibility issue of some players only having the 3-button controller. Which I guess sort of makes sense, except that such players would have no way of rope slinging at all unless they assigned rope to one of the attack buttons, which means they're kind of in the same boat anyway. The breakers don't have the same long delay, and they're also much weaker. It makes it frustrating to have to shoot an enemy, wait for it to go off, and then shoot again, otherwise the projectile goes right through them. It's also not as fun not being able to see that slow, dawning realization that they're about to blow up. Call me sadistic, I guess. On the other hand, the exploding crates now do have a delay, which is kinda strange. Maybe I'm just used to being able to fire off a shot and have it erupt immediately. In any case, it's much less practical as a trap when you can't predict where your enemies will be quite as well. Also, you can't set it off with your inductance rope, meaning you'll need to use up energy, or run up and kick it. The level design is also slightly different. Enemies appear in different locations, and you find weapons in different places. Not a bad thing, I guess. And if you find yourself a die-hard fan of Phantom 2040, it might make it worth it to play this version as well, just to give yourself a fresh challenge.
Overall, it's still good, but it's still just a shadow of the greatness of the SNES version. You know, it's like comparing Ninja Turtles 2 Secret of the Ooze with Ninja Turtles 1. I mean, both are good, but only one has Vanilla Ice. Wait, is that the right one? Yeah. So just keep that in mind. In this case, Nintendo is what Sega ain't. It doesn't really have the same ring to it, does it? This is Tom from the internet, and there is no reset button. It's more of like a switch. You sort of slide it. And, you know.
Fuck you, Gumby!